In this video, we will have a look at how to make our code more professional with the Context API from React. Welcome to Dev World, my name is Sam. We still have our app here, so our CRUD functionality up here, our filter down here, and everything still works. But what we have in the code at the moment is a different approach to how to use state and data. You can see our app.js is decluttered now, and we made this happen with Context API. The Context API comes directly from React and is something similar if you maybe already have worked with something like Redux. I've thought about how to do this video for a while, if I should go into detail how the Context API exactly works, or if I should just focus more about how to apply the Context API to an application. I decided that I'd rather show you how to implement it, so that's why in this video I'll sometimes will not go into too much detail, just that you know that. But at the end of the day you will know how the Context API works, when to implement it, and I'm also going to show you how to use this handy tool I made to make it easier to implement the Context API in your next application. So let's get started. So why do we want the Context API instead of having our data in our app.js? We want the Context API that we are more organized. It's also easier if you have shared state. So if one component and another component share the state. Common examples are if we have a common alert, or if you have theming, let's say dark mode or something like that. And that just in general that we have components that don't share the same parent, that they can have the same state. It also helps with something that we like to do in coding, and especially with React, which is called separation of concerns. So that we just have our view components, so the components that actually render something to the DOM, and that we have our state and our data and our functions in different kinds of areas in our code base. So in the last couple of videos, our application looked like this. We had our state and our functions in our app.js. So this looked like this. So this is our app.js. We have our React state hooks here, and we have all of our functions down here. So this is what this resembles. So then we had the data and the function here, and we passed it down through props. First the first component, and then that component had different childrens, and those childrens also got their functions and their data through props again. That's what we call with React props drilling. And that's okay if you have 1 or 2 layers of different components, but let's imagine you have 5, 6, or even 7 layers of components. This can get quite chaotic. If we just have a little bit of data, we have to prop drill all the way down here, for example, if we just need 1 or 2 states. So that's why there is something that's called Context API, where we have our state and our functions in a separate kind of entity, which we again call context. And then we can directly access this data and these functions in our components. And if needed, then those components can distribute their state and their functions to other components. But the advantage is we don't have to do that, like in this example where we could pass data and functions directly to our child components. Later in this video, we're going to see how these child components are able to access the data and the functions without the props. But this is really one of the big advantages with context. So in our example, this is now the new code base. This is the app.js, where we can see we don't have any functions or any states or any hooks or anything in here next to our components and this new state wrapper, so the listings state. What this exactly is, we will go into more in depth in this video. And you can also see the only thing that is new at the moment here is that we have a new folder context with another folder listings, and there we have the 3 files, which is listings context, listings reducer, and listings state. What we will do in this video is this method, which I like to work with usually, is if we have kind of distributor components that get the state from the context, so not from the app.js, but from the context, and then we will use the props to pass down data and the functions to our child components. These distributor components have also what I call handler functions. What I mean by that, we will see afterwards in the video as well. So let's jump into our code and see how everything works. So first of all, let's check out our 3 new files. First, let's start with listings context, and we can see this is just a file that is responsible to create context with the create context function from React. What we will do with that, we will see in a bit, but let's go first to the listings reducer file. And this might seem very familiar to you if you have already used Redux. So this is pretty much the same thing where we have an action type and the state. In the listings reducer, we only care about things that have to do with the state. So functions where we want to manipulate the state. So where before we had an add listings function in our app.js, we now have that in our listings reducer file. And then we call those functions in our listings state, which has the base listings up here, and then the different methods and functions down here. Then we also have a listing state component where we have an initial state with the state we are already used to from our previous videos. The only thing that changed that we added here a loading state. So if we set that to true, for example, and check out our app, we can see loading here. All right, let's go from top to bottom. First, we have a use listings hook. So this is a custom hook. We will talk about that later. But here we have all the methods we are already used to from our previous videos. So let's check out delete listing, for example. Here we can see we don't delete the listings directly here, but we call something that's called dispatch. Dispatch takes in an object as an argument with a type. And in our example, we call that a payload, which in this example with the delete function is the ID coming in as a parameter. And then dispatch itself comes in as a function as a parameter as well. Where this is coming from, we will have a look later. But when this delete listing function is called, this dispatch function is called. And then this dispatch function works in a way with the context API, which in the backend is a little bit complicated. So I won't talk about that in this video, but this will dispatch this type or this action type to the listings reducer. So the listings reducer takes in a state and an action. And again, this might be a little bit confusing, but the context API handles that below the hood. And here with that action, we can access that here as an action.type. So this is this type here, which is delete listing. And then we have our switch statement here. And then the action type, if that is equal to delete listing, this function here will be called. And we can see that this is the method, the same method that we used in the old code base. So here in our app.js, in our handle delete click. So that's exactly the same functionality like we have here in our reducer. What is different though is that we here spread the additional state up here in this object and that we also set loading to false. Let's talk about loading later. So here we have the action.payload, which is the ID. So in our old application, we have this as an e.target.value, which of course comes in here as a parameter. But here in our reducer, we have this as the action.payload. So the action.payload is actually this here, where we put in the ID as the value. And this ID, of course, comes where we call the delete listings function, which is in our real estate listings component. So we can see we have a handler here called handle delete click. And there we will call delete listing with the listings dispatch. We will talk about that later also. And then the id.target.value. So these arguments in here come in here as a parameter. And then this is the dispatch function that will be called down here. And then of course the other, which is the e.target.value, which is the ID in this example, which gets put in here as a payload, which then will be used here in this function as the action.payload. Then of course this function returns a new array, so with this filter method, and will be put in here as a state for the listings. So we spread the rest of the states here. We have a new array in this listing state, and we set the loading state to false because in our listing state, so in this delete listings function, we set the loading. So what happens if we set loading? So we call set loading. This is this function down here. There we take in the dispatch. So the dispatch coming as a parameter here, getting put in here as an argument, and then being again a parameter here. I hope you can follow that. And then this is the dispatch function with the type set loading, which then again will use the listings reducer. And set loading spreads the rest of the state and sets loading to true. So how does it look like in our application? Let's have a look. So if we delete something, set loading is set to true and then to false after we deleted the element. So let's delete an element. And we can see we can't actually see the loading component because it runs so fast that we can't actually see it. But again, if we set loading to true down here manually, we can see our loading component. So we can see if is loading, where this is coming from, we will see in a bit. Then we return the h2, which is our loading component. Else if there is the current listings.length equals to null. So we already had that in our previous videos. Then we have no results here, of course. And else, so if those two are not true, then we will return our real estate cards. All right, you're most probably gonna ask yourself, Where is loading coming from? Where is this delete listing function coming from? And how generally do we access functions and state in our components with the context API? If you remember, with the context API, we are able to access state and functions without the props. So we can access them directly in the context. So how this works, we will have a look right now. So again, we have the listings context component, which only takes care of creating the context. Then we have the reducer, which its sole idea is to handle everything that in regards to the state. And then we have the listing state, which takes care of dispatching all of the functions. So again, let's go from top to bottom. So let's close that up. So again, here we have our custom hook. We will talk about that again a little later. Here we have all the dispatch functions. So all of those functions only take care of dispatching different kinds of types. And down here we have the listing state, which we saw before, which has an initial state. Let's set that to false again. And that initial state is taken in here in this use reducer hook, which comes directly from React. So this use reducer hook takes in the initial state as a second parameter, and the first parameter is the listings reducer, which comes in here from our listings reducer file, which at the end of the day is this whole switch statement. So this whole file will be exported here and taken in here as the listings reducer in this use reducer hook. And from this hook, we are able to access the state and the dispatch. And this state and dispatch, we will put in here as a value. So here in our listings context.provider. This is kind of a wrapper with all of our functions and all of our states, which we have up here. And then this will render the children. And with this whole wrapper, we use that in our app.js as the listing state. So you can see the listing state, which is exported, or in this example here in the app.js, imported from our listings state. And these are the children that are represented here, which come from the prop up here. So whichever components we want to have access to all of our functions and state, we will put in here as the children and wrap them with our listings state. I hope this already made sense till now. I know it's a little bit overwhelming, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually not that bad anymore, and it's really great to use if you have a mid-size or a bigger application. But let's now focus a little bit more on how exactly the components access these states and these functions that we have provided here in the listing state. So we now know that these components here have access to the functions and components. So let's go to real estate listing. So this is the real estate listing component, and we can see up here two things happen. First of all, we import different functions and also the use listings hook. So let's check out the use listings hook here in our listing state file. So this is our custom hook, use listings, which uses a hook from React use context. So use context comes in from React directly. And the use context takes in the listings context, which comes in here from our listings context file. So from this file with the create context function. And we can access state and dispatch from this use context hook, and we will return that as an array with state and dispatch. So that's why we're able to use this use listings hook as a hook, because we return an array with state and dispatch. So this use listings hook is exported here and then imported in our component, in this example, the real estate listing component. So we import the use listing hook here, and then we access the listing state and the listings dispatch, which at the end of the day is this one. So the state and dispatch, we just rename them here to listing state and listings dispatch, which again are from use listings. So the listing state, we take that and we use object deconstruction here to take out the states we need. So this is the listing state. So this is the reference for this one here. And then we object deconstruct listings, query, filtered listings, is filtered, and loading, which are all states from our listing state here. So all states from in here. So here in our real estate listings component, so in our consumer, we are able to import them in here with this use listings hook coming from the listing state. And then now we have access to all of those states. So let's check that out. Let's console log listings. And here in our app, we can see we now have access to those listings through the console. So that's how we actually import different states into our components. So we already know what we do with the listing state, but for what is the listings dispatch? The listings dispatch will be put in here as an argument in our functions coming directly, so being exported from our listing state file. So we can see this gets imported here from the listing state file from our context. In this file, we only use the delete listings, the edit click, and the filter listings functions. So again, these functions come here from listing state directly from here. So filter listings, delete listings, and the last one was edit click, which is this function here. So in our component here, we import them, and then we have these handle functions, which in this example only call the delete listing function, and put in the dispatch here as a parameter. And then of course, in this example, the e.target.value, or in our handle click function, for example, we first manipulate the data so we can take them in as a parameter here. And then also again, call our function, in this example, edit click, which comes from the context. We put in listings dispatch first as an argument, and then the new item coming from here. So you might ask yourselves, why do we have to put in the listings dispatch here as an argument? And again, I won't go into too much detail about the context API and how it works in the backend. But at the end of the day, we will need that here then in our function. So for example, in the edit listings functions here as a dispatch, to take it in as a function, which we are able to call down here. All right, I hope this made some sense so far. Let's go back into our component and see where we actually call the handle edit click, for example. So the handle edit click here will be passed down as a prop to our real estate card. And again, we can see in our real estate card, this will be passed or taken in here as a parameter, and then again be passed down to real estate card image. So let's track that down even further. So here in our real estate card image, we again take it in as a parameter, and then finally we have it here as an on-click handler. And now you might say, but Sam, why don't we just import it? So we will take it here. So we take that here and go directly into our component up here and call the edit click function directly down here. And this actually is a very good question. And for that, let's go back to our little sketch we have here. That's what I meant with handler functions. So how I like to use the context API, I want to have components which are higher up in the tree handling these handle functions, and those are the only components taking in functions and state from our context. Of course, we could also have it directly like this, where our cards take in directly the functions and the state, or we could also have it more directly, where our image, for example, takes in the state directly. But as I said, I like to work with the context like that, where I have kind of distributor functions that then pass those states and those functions as props. But this really comes down to what you prefer and what you think is best for your specific application. All right, I hope this made sense till now. I just want to have a look at how we use the use effect hook now with the new context API. So you might remember in our old code, so this is our old code, we had a function in here which set the filtered listings state in our use effect, where you could use very elegantly different side effects here in our dependencies array, which in our example were listings and query, to call this function. If you don't know how the use effect hook works, check out the previous videos. So here in our new code, we don't have directly a function in here anymore. We call the filtered listings functions, which again comes from our listings state file. And this filter listings functions, let's search it here, is down here. And we can see this dispatches the filter listings in our reducer. So in our reducer, the filter listings is here. So you can see this is the exact same functionality that we had here in our use effect directly put in here. So here we set the filtered listings to this new filtered array, which comes from this filter method. If we have an action.payload, so let's check out what the action.payload is. So the action.payload is the query. So if we have a query, then we will spread the state. So that means we return the additional state, and then we return the filtered listings, as I said, as this new array here. Else, if we don't have a query, we will return the state and we will return the filtered listings as an empty array. So like in our old function. So again, this is our old function. So if we have a query, we return this new array and we set filtered listings to this new filtered listings array. Else, if we don't have a query, we set the filtered listings to an empty array. So the exact same thing as we had here. And that's the beautiful thing about the reducer and about having the listing state. So everything is in its place. So if you want to manipulate state, you do that in the reducer. And if you want to call something else, you do that in the listing state or in the handler functions. So in the real estate listing, so in our component, we can see we have listings dispatch put in here in our dependencies array. So why do we do that? So let's delete that, for example, and let's save and open the terminal. And we can see we get a warning here, React hook use effect has a missing dependency, listings dispatch. So we have to put that in. Why exactly is a little bit complicated. I will have something linked in the description down below. If you're interested, you can read about that. But just make sure if you have that in here, you just put the listings dispatch here in the dependencies array also. And now if we save that, we can see we don't get an error anymore. All right, as a summary, we have a new folder here with 3 different files. The first file just takes care of creating the context. The reducer just takes care of everything in regards to manipulating the state. And the listing state exports the different functions and dispatches the right kind of functions in the reducer, and also exports this use listings hook, which we then use or consume in our components. And in our components, we can't forget to use the listings dispatch here as an argument in our called functions, imported here from our listings state. And we also can't forget to wrap our components in this listing state provider, where we have now access to our functions and to our state in whatever components we render here as the children. All right, you might ask yourself, is it really worth the hassle to put down all these extra code we have here, where before we just had it in the app.js? So this is what I want to tackle right now, when exactly to use the context API over just having the regular hooks from use state. So in my opinion, in a little example like this, where we just have a couple of components, we easily are able to use the use state hooks and the different functions here in our app.js. But if it's anything bigger like that, we should use the context API. Also, if we have a lot of shared states or shared state between the components, we also should use the context API or a state handler like Redux or Zustand or anything like that. So different state libraries. In a later video, we will talk about when to use the context API and when to use Redux. But for now, I want to make it even easier for you to choose the context API, even though if you're like me, a little lazy to write all the boilerplate, because I actually created a kind of a handy tool, which is this code snippet generator. So here you can only put in the name as a plural, the name as a singular, and your unique selector. And this application will spit out the code, or at least the boilerplate code you need for the context API. So let's have an example. So let's have an error alert here. So error alerts, and then error alert here as a singular name, and then the unique selector, which most probably going to be ID or something like value. In our example, this will be ID. And then down here, we can choose which actions we would like. So get, add, delete, and edit. So all of our kind of CRUD functionality here. And you can see we have now an error alert state. So what you can do here is just click on the copy symbol. You can copy that, go into your application, then in your context folder, create a new folder with error alerts, and then a new file, and you can just paste in the new file here. Then go back to the tool, you copy that. So you copy all the code, and you can go in here, copy and paste that here. And then you have already the boilerplate code set up. So you have the error alerts, for example, this would be, so standard wise, this comes as an empty array, an error state, which is set to null, and the loading, which is set to false. And you can do that the same with the reducer. So down here is all of the code for the reducer, and then here also for the context. And then you might have to change some of the functionality in here, which might be specific to your application, but this should make writing a context API way faster. And then also you have the imports here. So the first import is for the app.js for the wrapper. So if you remember where we had the provider, this of course is the provider itself. And then these two down here, so this is the import for in your component. So where you want to import different states from your context. And of course here you have to delete that and specify the different functions you want to import. So for example, get error alerts or add error alerts or something like that. And here you have the import, which uses the use alert hook created here. So I hope this tool makes it a little bit easier for you to create your context API and that you're more likely to use it, because at the end of the day, it's really a handy tool if you have that, especially for any kind of mid or even large sized application. All right, that was pretty much it for this video. In the next video, we will talk about how to use the context API with taking in a real REST API. Because here, of course, we just had these listings hard-coded in here, but usually if you have a context API, you will take in an API from the outside with something like Fetch or Axios. So in the next couple of videos, we will have a look at how I saw it sometimes in a wrong way. So if you have learned it from YouTube, there is a big possibility you have learned it the wrong way. And then I will show you how to use the context API correctly. But yet again, more about that in the next videos. So make sure to subscribe to not miss that. I hope you liked this video and I hope to see you in the next one.